Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions. Nobel Prize-winning Professor of Astronomy and Astrophysics at the Australian National University, Brian Schmidt. Education Minister, Christopher Pyne. Comedian Ruby Wax, whose new show, Sane New World, builds on her study of psychotherapy. Musician, filmmaker and activist Michael Franti, who's currently touring Australia for Bluesfest. And the Shadow Minister for Trade and Investment, Penny Wong. Please welcome our panel. Thank you, and remember, if you've got a live Twitter question to send us, add @Quanda to help us find it. Let's go straight to our first question from in the room. It's from Annette Gary.
Hi, I'm curious, is there a difference between a suicidal pilot and a suicide bomber? Whatever rationalisation they use to justify taking the lives of innocent people in their own quest to self-destruct, what's the role of mental illness in both cases?
Christopher Pyne, let's start with you.
Look, it's a very serious and a very good question. I mean, I would say that in both cases, both people are suffering from a mental illness. Now, unfortunately, they decide to take out a whole lot of other people, innocent people, with them and destroy their own lives, and leave a wreckage behind for the families of suicide victims. I was the Parliamentary Secretary for Health many years ago and created an organisation called Headspace, the Youth Mental Health Initiative with Pat McGorry, so I have some understanding about mental health and how to try and treat it from a government point of view, and Pat McGorry obviously was a fantastic person to have as the first CEO and was Australian of the Year for his work with young people with mental illness. The problem with mental illness is not rational. It's very hard, therefore, to describe how people react in these kinds of situations. Obviously, we have to get help to all of them as early as possible so they don't do something terrible like what's happened recently in France, and every suicide bomber, of course, is a tragedy.
Now, can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Ruby.
How much of the government money do you actually put to brain research? I'm just curious.
I don't know the exact number.
Yeah.
I mean, we have in Australia some fantastic brain research institutes, one here in Sydney, the Mind and Brain Research Institute.
No, I'm talking about the government, because certainly in the UK...
Well, that's mostly funded by the government, the Brain and Mind Research Institute.
But compared to, let's say, other illnesses, because in England and certainly in the United States, brain research gets far, far less than every other illness put together.
It's a good point.
And then we would have an answer to this question, because if you don't put money into brain research, this is going to continue on, and it isn't a small minority. It's 1 out of 4 people. So if it's 1, 2, 3, 4, could be you.
Well, the answer, well, some would say it was, but it's not a laughing matter. I mean, mental illness is not a laughing matter.
Well,
so
I know that.
We shouldn't be laughing about it. But the truth is, early in the 2000s, the federal government didn't put a lot of money into mental health. It was seen to be a state government responsibility. I was the Parliamentary Secretary for Health to Tony Abbott, who's now the Prime Minister, as you would know, and we jumped right into mental health in a way that we hadn't done. And it was mostly bipartisan, so we created Headspace for youth mental health, and then we put $1.9 billion into mental health programs in 2006. One of those was to put psychologists on the Medicare schedule, so you could go to the psychologist.
I'm not meaning to interrupt here, but
I was asked a question.
I know you were asked a question by one of the panellists, and I'm going to just take control back again.
I don't know the rules.
I thought you might remember them from the last time you were here.
Free-flowing.
Now, Ruby, let's stick with the audience question, though. I mean, I know that the chief psychiatrist, in fact, the Simon Wesley, is the president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK, is very worried there's going to be a knee-jerk reaction here and a backlash against any pilots who have a history of depression. Well, you have a history of depression. What do you think?
Well, I never enrolled to be a pilot, but if it's 1 in 4 people, imagine what's going to happen now. I mean, again, we have to take some responsibility. There hasn't been a lot of research into the brain compared to, I'm not denigrating it, but breast cancer. It's just not considered a sexy charity. And there was a dean at Oxford who said that, I don't know if this is I can say this, but I'm saying it. If Bill Gates had donated the money he did for malaria, we would have had a cure for mental illness. Now, I'm not making a judgment, but it's our job, and I know the government doesn't give that much, everything emanates from a brain disease, okay? Depression isn't because you thought maybe I should play golf or have depression. It's actually a physiological disease, and it has to be respected that way. Everything emanates, everything we're going to talk about emanates from the brain. Crime, drugs, diabetes too, obesity, heart disease, infertility, everything comes from the mothership. You can get sympathy for any other disease on any other organ except the brain. And until we wake up to that, nothing's going to change.
It's not talked about disease in the way that
let's however, talk about what the question was about, and I'll go to...
Annette?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm from America, and I don't know everything that's going on in this country, but in my country in the 80s, we saw the Reagan administration slash funding for mental health. And what it led to was an outbreak of thousands of people who became homeless because of mental illness, veterans, people who had alcoholism, simple things that we feel like we should be able to take care of with proper mental health care, ended up becoming a massive burden on all of our society, everything from people panhandling on the street every day in people's lives to millions and millions of dollars having to be spent beyond what would have been spent to take care of people's needs, to house them and to clothe them and to take care of the crime and all the things that came out of that. And you talked about, is there a difference between a suicide bomber and a person who just does it on their own for whatever reason or because they have a mental illness? And I wrote a song years ago called Bomb the World, and the lyrics say we can bomb the world to pieces, but we can't bomb it into peace. And I would argue that, is there also mental illness in us going around to other countries and bombing them? And so I believe that all bombing is wrong, and it doesn't solve the problems that we think it does, whether it's just because you're a disgruntled individual, whether it's because you have mental illness, or it's because you're trying to impose your will on another people in another nation.
But eventually they will have, if there was some research into this, that yes, you could test just the way you can for cancer. You have mental illness. There's no question with Alzheimer's. I mean, you wouldn't say to somebody with Alzheimer's, come on, you can remember where you left the key. So same with mental illness. There's a moment where it might be fanatic, it might be narcissistic, it might be neurotic. But if you're talking about a specific disease, it's physiological, and that should be tested by this point.
Penny Wong, I'll bring you back to the last part of that question, which was, is there a difference between a suicidal pilot and a suicide bomber?
Well, I don't know that I could say what the difference in causation is, if any, and I don't think any of us really know that, do we? But in terms of how we respond to the grief of those who've lost loved ones, and at a policy level, I think you have to respond both on, as Ruby has said, to do what governments have started to do more of here in Australia on a bipartisan basis, and as you would know, we did put a couple of $1 billion into mental health with Mark Butler as Minister. But you also have to, understand the cultural reasons why people don't discuss this as much. It's hard to navigate, isn't it, finding help for a mental illness, and we've improved it somewhat, but we've got a long way to go.
Brian, I think people are trying to get their heads around the fact that a civilian pilot in an aeroplane full of ordinary people could fly his plane quite deliberately into a mountain. So I guess that's the text of the question there.
Yeah, so I think the reason maybe why we're all so, repulsed by this is it does seem, I think, even a little different than a suicide bomber. Because within our culture, we have, I think, causes. Now, sometimes the causes are misguided. Suicide bomber, I would say, is a misguided cause. But this is someone who didn't have a cause except for some, I guess, their own view of wanting to make a mark, it seems, based on the beginnings. So I see both as having issues related to mental health, but I do see it as being slightly different in the way I guess we all perceive causes, because when you're asked to, for example, go to war for Australians, the Anzacs in World War I, it was for a cause which they thought was correct. And so I guess that doesn't fit into that paradigm, and that's why, at least it bothers me. It was just so random that it's not that it's better or worse, it's just that it's hard to understand.
Christopher, I'll bring you back in there because there's always pressure on governments when things like this happen to do something. And what that British psychiatrist is worried about is that pilots with a history of depression are going to be singled out. And in fact, the Civil Aviation Authority in Britain says there are 100 pilots flying now with a history of depression, 42 of them on medication as we speak. So the fear is there'll be a backlash. What do you think?
Well, I think the most important thing we can do is not have a backlash that stigmatises people with a mental illness. I mean, one of the reasons why people don't talk about mental illness is the stigma that is attached to it. And Australia, we're coming off a low base. I mean, Michael was talking about the Reagan administration cutting expenditure on mental illness. I'm not even sure that in Australia we had reached first base. Now, we are now getting to the point where we are talking about mental illness and suicide in a way that in Australia we haven't culturally been good at. In the last perhaps 10 to a dozen years, we've talked about it, and to both Labor and Liberals' credit, when we started Headspace, Labor came to power, they kept it going, they put more money into it, they opened more centres. We put $1.9 billion in, as Penny points out, when Mark Butler was the Minister for Mental Health. And there wasn't a Minister for Mental Health until the mid-2000s, late 2000s in Australia, because as a culture, I think we've always thought, well, you just got to get on with it. You know, you've got to get over it and get on with it. So the worst thing we could do in Australia now would be to drive people with mental illness even further underground, not to talk about their problem, because that's not going to solve the problem.
Or not to get treatment.
Or
not to get the treatment they desperately need.
OK, we'll move on because we've got quite a lot of questions on different subjects. Our next question is from Nikki McCarthy.
Thanks, Tony. In my former life as a police officer, I dealt with a lot of heroin users, and I saw the devastating effects on their families, on the community and on the health service. And I'd argue that our approach with heroin failed. The report that came out from the Australian Crime Commission last week paints a really scary picture of the ice epidemic, and I'm interested to hear the panel's thoughts on what we could do to tackle this perhaps a little differently to the way that we tackled heroin.
Michael, let's start with you.
Well, again, I don't know exactly how it's dealt with here, Nikki, but in America, we have a problem with ice, and we've had a problem since the 80s with crack. And I've seen crack in my neighborhood where I live in San Francisco. It's probably 95% black neighborhood. And it really hit our community really hard. There was a lot of unemployment, and a lot of people turned to selling crack as a means of earning a living. And I've seen it take the strongest of men and completely cripple them and bring them down to their knees. And today in Hawaii, we have a really bad problem with ice. And so
why in Hawaii, Michael?
I don't know. I think that the main reason was that they couldn't get crack cocaine there, you know, shipped out to that remote island, and so they were making crystal meth in their bathtub, and they were able to make ice from the crystal meth. We've got the same problem in regional Australia.
Yeah. Ice is an even bigger problem in regional Australia than it is in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, because it can be made so easily.
Can you say why?
Well, I think it's because it can be made so easily by almost anybody.
But why is it so needed in this particular culture?
Well, it's just the newest terrible drug. I mean, it's a horror drug because it's so addictive. Now, with lots of other drugs like heroin, very addictive, but we've worked out ways of replacing heroin and trying to get people off it through morphine, etc. Ice is incredibly addictive and acts so fast that you're addicted to ice virtually with the first smoke or injection or however you use it. And it's very big in regional Australia, I think, because of its cheapness and because you can make it yourself. There's a combination of factors. I don't want to take over if you didn't want me to answer.
No, I do.
I think the way, Nikki, that we failed in America is that we went after petty peddlers and we locked them up for long stretches of time. 5-year mandatory minimum sentencing for a first offense. And we put an incredible burden on our state resources by having to lock up criminals at $60,000 a year for petty drug offenses for selling a product to addicts who should be treated for an addiction and not for just a crime. And I think that that's the main thing that where we really failed is we didn't treat the addiction. We just went after criminalizing these drugs, and it bankrupted my state in California. We spend $60,000, $70,000 a year locking up first-time drug offenders, and it's crippled us.
Let's go to Christopher Pyne. I mean, it's a slightly different problem here in terms of the scale of it, but if ICE really does take off in regional Australia in the way that the National Crime Commission is worried about, they think it's actually going to be the worst epidemic that's hit the country.
Yeah, and it's not if it takes off, it's taking off. I mean, we are in a crisis right now around ICE, and there's a combination of factors that we need to respond to that. Obviously, interdicting ICE before it gets onto the streets is a big start. But educating people about the dangers of using ICE and its addictive nature is really vitally important. It's very hard to treat ICE addicts because ICE is a drug that we haven't been used to, so treatment is almost, you almost lost the battle if you got to that point.
Is there a plan to do something though? I mean, I haven't seen a national advertising campaign.
Well, I just disagree with that point right there. I don't think there's ever a point where you've lost the battle with an addict. And I grew up in a family of addicts. My father was an alcoholic for most of my life. And at age 55, he, after having been an alcoholic since his teens, he stopped drinking. So I don't believe it's ever too late to give up, and I don't ever believe that we should get to that point where we feel like systemically we have to give up on a group of people just because it's the newest, strongest, most powerful
We're just talking about almost the formula of it. The point is to find out why the individual feels the need to kind of, you know, take their life.
So you have to address employment issues.
Well, again,
and boredom
study
issues.
the brain, figure out why there's a disgruntled society. Again, don't blame it on, you know, economy, the global. It's us. Something something is sick,
susceptible?
and I mean all of us. I don't just mean them. You know, that we're living in a society where you'd rather die than just compete, and where, you know, the busyness and the pressure to be successful and the whole thing. Culminates in that. So let's look again at the psychology of the individual rather than always, oh, it's this fault, somebody imported something. It's because we needed it.
Michael, some say that ICE was actually glamorised by a television show called Breaking Bad, where you've got the absent-minded professor who starts creating the drug in his backyard, and he's cool dealer. No, I'm not confusing that one because.
No, I know, but he wasn't an absent-minded professor. He knew exactly what the recipe was.
Yes, he did. No, you're right about that.
I defend him.
But he's at the beginning he's a humorous guy, and at the end he's a very evil character. So I'm just wondering whether that show had some sort of role in glamorising this particular drug.
I don't think so.
I don't know. Maybe it was ISIL.
Yeah. Question's got a hand up. It's going to go back. Let's go back to Nikki. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Minister Pyne, I take your point about education. When will we see a national coordinated education program like we have with smoking and the drink driving campaigns?
Well, we've had one on ICE in the past. We have to renew it. That's a job for Michael Keenan and Susan Lee, working together in health and in justice. We run campaigns about ICE. They were, at the time, quite successful because I had responsibility for drugs for a little while, for 4 years, in fact, in the Howard government. We did a good job pushing, but this goes to Ruby's point. We pushed down heroin use and we pushed down marijuana use, and other drugs went up. At the time, it was cocaine and ice. Then we pushed down ice and we pushed down cocaine, and other drugs replace it. So the point Ruby makes is, as a society, we have to address the reasons why people feel so helpless or hopeless that they turn to drugs.
Brian, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, it really comes down to, I think, education and the systemic cause of what is causing people the need to use drugs. And that comes into a very complex set of people having their lives maybe not being as good as, you know, my life, which is, you know, pretty good, but out in rural Australia, it can be pretty tough. It's education isn't as good, jobs aren't as good. It is a place that, I guess, causes people to feel the need to turn to something else, and you need to address that, and that's a hard problem.
All right, let's speak about education more broadly. You're watching Q&A live across Australia and on iView and News Radio. The next question comes from Noah Hoffman.
As a high school student completing Year 12 this year, I would like to ask Christopher Pyne to convince me why I can remain optimistic that all my fellow Year 12 students who are looking to enter university in the near future will have an equal opportunity under your proposed reforms, regardless of their socioeconomic circumstances. And how can you guarantee that we won't be disadvantaged or advantaged by our socioeconomic circumstances?
Christopher Pyne.
Well, I think that's a great question. The truth is that there will be many, many more opportunities and places for Australians to go to university under the government's higher education reforms through a number of means. We have a fantastic university system, one of the world's best, but it could be even better. And it's vitally important that we maintain our reputation for high-quality research and teaching. What I'm trying to do with these reforms is actually remove the caps on the pre-degree places to have the biggest scholarship scheme in Australian history so that more students get to go to university. And the estimates are that about 120,000 more Australians will get to go to university under the government's proposal than under the Labor Party's caps proposal. So the great thing about Australia, which is different to the United States, is we have the higher education contribution scheme. Nobody can be denied a place at university in Australia because of their socioeconomic status, because everyone can borrow from the taxpayer and pay back on very low interest when they earn over $50,000 a year. What that's meant since the Labor Party introduced it, in fact, in 1988-89, is that the number of people getting to go to university has exponentially increased, regardless of people's socioeconomic status, because they can see that they can get to go to uni and they can pay it back later through the tax system. So we have one of the most equitable systems in the world, and our reforms maintain HECS and make it even more equitable for all those young Australians who want to do a pathways degree into uni. I'll just say one last quick thing. The Kemp Norton report found that if a student from a low SES background did a pathways course before they did their undergraduate degree, they had a 1% dropout rate. If they didn't, they had a 24% dropout rate.
OK, I was going to quickly go back to Noah. What is it you're actually worried about? Is it the amount of money you're going to have to pay at the end on your HECS, or what?
Yeah.
What is?
I just feel like when students, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds, will look at these new reforms, that they'll be scared by them and will believe that they'll never be able to pay them back in the future, and they'll lose confidence in themselves.
Well, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So last year
we're going to let a few other people taste that pudding before you do. Brian, can we hear from Brian Schmidt?
So I think the HECS scheme really makes it possible for students to pay back because there is no downstream risk. The problem, I guess, is whether or not students will be getting good value for their education, which is going to be part of the equation. So if you have a scheme and universities charge lots of money because they can, then the question will be, will you be getting good value on that, or will you decide that it's just not worth it? That would be the downside. And so from my perspective, I do have concern of the value because right now we do cross-subsidize research, which is what I do, from student fees. And that is, I think, a fundamental distortion to the system that has the potential to make value poor for students if we go through and differentiate on price. On the other hand, we have the problem right now that, for example, at ANU, you do a science degree at ANU, you get taught by people like me, we have great labs, you get to do research, and we get the exact same amount of money as the weakest university in the country. So, you know, it's very difficult for us to maintain that standard when, quite frankly, we don't actually get enough money back from fees as they currently are.
So, quick question, do you favour the deregulation plan or not?
I favour some form of deregulation, but I think there needs to be a cap to keep prices from going out of sight because we have HECS, which is essentially a subsidy, and we have monopoly players like the ANU in Canberra if you want to do research. And so I think you need to balance that out.
In this,
I would hear from Penny Wong
go
first,
ahead, Penny.
then I'll come to you after Penny, Michael.
Well, let's be clear for all of the fine words that Christopher just gave you. His plan is for deregulation, which means no limit on what universities can charge. And as you know, there's been a range of modelling put out which suggests degrees up to $100,000. Well, there has been, Christopher, and unfortunately the facts are that you're proposing a system which doesn't have accessibility and equity at its core. That's the problem.
No, it's not.
And that's why so many people.
That's not what's happening.
That is what. Well, that is all.
Yeah.
Yes, and that is why the Senate has soundly rejected your proposition on a number of occasions, and why so many people are concerned about the capacity of either themselves or their children getting an education, because, as we know, it is the great enabler. It is the great way in which we can increase opportunity in this country. 190,000 more Australians went to university when Labor was in government because of our reforms. Now, I'm up for a discussion about reform. The Labor Party's up for a discussion about reform. We're not up for a discussion that makes university education harder to access for people like you.
Now, Michael, one of the things being said about the deregulation is it'll make Australian universities more like American universities with the same flexibility. Your view?
Go.
Yeah, ouch. In America, the state schools where I live in California, the University of California system costs $35,000 a year for students to go to. If you go to a private school in America, like a Stanford or a Harvard, it's over $50,000 a year. And what happened in America, again, during the 80s and the Reagan administration, is there was all kinds of federal cuts for grants and for loans for students, low-interest loans, and those loans were given out to the private sector. And so now students are going to school and coming out with an undergraduate degree of having to pay off $200,000 in loans. And so students are not going into the things that they love, they're going into the things that they think are going to make them money. Another thing that's happened with universities is that the science of these private institutions has become, rather than doing things to solve world problems or to solve real diseases that are taking place, mental illness, things that are underfunded, these universities become research laboratories for private corporations who, rather than trying to figure out those things, they're looking for a bigger, better, cheaper Viagra pill, you know, that can sell a lot, which I'm sure a lot of politicians would probably like that Viagra pill. But
do you want to jump in there, Christopher, by any chance?
The point is...
Tony, that was mean, really.
Not what I expect.
So I think what we can agree on is that we have a system right now, which we have a good university system here, and we have managed through the HEX system to avoid many of the problems that the US has, and I'm wedded to the HEX system beyond anything you can imagine. But I do think that you two would both agree that we want our education system to be excellent, we want it to be equitable, and we want it to be fair value. And the current system does not provide that. We need to change it, and we need, this is a 20-year problem. We don't, you know, the higher education reforms from 1988, 89, those are 25, 26 years old. I met John Dawkins last week and says they need to be changed. It needs to be changed.
He agrees with these.
So we need to change, but we need to come up with a framework for change. It doesn't mean it has to be what you're on the table. It doesn't mean what you have on the table. We need to find a framework you guys could agree on so that we can move the system on.
That's a very good point for me to bring in our next question. It's from Joseph Lloyd, and it's about the whole question of agreement.
Senator Wong, you and the crossbenchers have blocked Minister Pyne's education bill after 2 attempts.
Yep.
And, sorry. So what specific changes do you need in his current bill to get it through the Senate, and how would you reform the education system for a 21st century Australia?
Well, we have blocked it, and I don't think there's any prospect from the Labor Party's perspective of supporting a deregulated system. I mean, Brian makes the good point about HEX and that that system of deferred payment essentially has managed to enable some equity in the system, but it can only go so far. And I don't think it can offset a system which is entirely deregulated and which sees the sorts of fees that we have seen NatSem and other stakeholders produce when they look at these reforms.
Well, no other stakeholders, actually. None.
Christopher, if your argument's so good, why is it nobody believes you?
Because people are worried by the Senate.
I mean, that's the reality.
Anyone, can I just interrupt there?
It's a good
What would you
question.
do?
And well, yes, and what Kim Carr has said is we're up for a discussion about what it should include. We haven't released a policy yet. That's true. We are working with the sector. The principles that I outlined, equity and access, I think will be front and centre. And we do understand what Brian said, that you need to look over the next 20 years.
But do you acknowledge that in 2012, when in government, you cut $2.3 billion from the higher education budget? Now, I mean...
I'm very happy to answer that question.
Kim Carr himself actually said it. In fact, when you look at it, it was actually more like $3.8 billion cut from higher education.
I'm very happy to answer that question because higher education funding grew under us over the period of government, quite substantially. I think it's over just under 7 billion, 6.8 billion to just under 9 billion. Per student funding grew under us. What we did do is we said we want to invest in the Gonski reforms. Remember the reforms that Christopher said there was a unity ticket on, to get more kids from disadvantaged schools able to get to the position where they could go into higher education. Yes, we did say to universities, you will grow more slowly. In the context of continued and rising funding from a government that continued to increase university funding, we said, we are going to ask you to grow more slowly, and we were going to put that money into some of Australia's most disadvantaged schools. Now, I think the argument for that from an educational and economic and equity perspective is sound.
OK, I just want to hear Brian on that. I mean, did the Labor Party fund you better than previous governments? I mean, what is the picture? You've been looking at this for some time.
I would say the sector's had some problems across both sides of government. And I think what we have by making universities more equitable, making the access larger, that is uncapped entries, we've caused this new problem where the more children you teach or kids you teach at a fixed price, the more money you make, and so it's driving quality down, and it's a distorted system we need to fix now. And so there are ways of dealing with essentially making a free market, but withheld by, for example, restricting the amount of government subsidies as you charge more and more. So you sort of put a soft cap in place so you get some competition within the sector, which I think would probably, and some differentiation within the sector, while not allowing prices to blow out to, $30,000 a year, which is what I think could happen.
It's hard to disagree with a Nobel laureate.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. Let's hear from another questioner, though, and see if you agree with him. Tim Naden has a question.
Thanks, Mel China. This question is primarily for Mr. Pyne and also for everyone. Mr. Pyne, you stated that university students earn more as a result of their education. You said they have less than 1% unemployment, they live longer and have healthier lives.
True.
So if university students earn more, have low unemployment, live longer and have healthier lives, wouldn't it be better to make it easier and cheaper to attend university?
Well, that's exactly what we're doing.
And also make it a priority for which we pay our taxes.
Yeah. Well, can I just respond to a few things on that front? Number one, the proof of the pudding that I'll come back to is that the enrolments this year are up. So if Labor's scare campaign was working, why are more young Australians enrolling this year than last year? That's the first thing.
You didn't get your changes to
Number
the
two,
How can that be a proof of anything?
Labor tried to scare people with a $100,000 degree scare campaign. Students knew better because of the higher education contribution scheme.
Right, OK.
America doesn't have a higher education contribution scheme. So comparing the United States system to our system is not a true comparison because we let anybody go to university and charge them zero up front, but you have to pay it back at low interest rates, at like 1.5% if that's the inflation rate, and only when you start earning over $50,000 a year. In terms of your question, we are trying to get more students into university, and that's what our reforms will deliver. At least 80,000 more students in pathways programs and non-university higher education providers on their way to university, doing university-level degrees. 37,000 more young Australians will get to go to university without caps, and Labor's only policy they've announced is to put the caps back on. So ironically, the Liberal Party is actually proposing to expand opportunity to all the kids in non-university higher education providers, all the TAFEs, all the institutions that offer pathways programs, so that in fact hundreds of thousands of more Australians over the next few years will get the chance to have better health outcomes, low unemployment, 75% on average higher incomes. Now, what Brian has pointed out is that we can't just keep doing what we're doing.
Okay, Christopher,
$6.6 billion
whilst we
in 3
may
years.
appreciate that, about 10 hands went up while you were talking. And Ruby, make your point. And I'll just ask our microphones to look for the people with their hands up. In the meantime, Ruby, what do you want to say?
I just want to know if you sound so convincing to me.
How come? It's true.
Well, no. How come people are still sceptical?
Well, Ruby, let's find out. Let's find out because there's quite a few people.
Must be lying.
Ruby, hang on. There's a gentleman up there. Let's hear quick comments from the audience. I want to get your comments. I'll start with you. Yes, you with your hand up there. Go ahead. Yes. Oh, sorry, you've moved away from him. He's right there. Go ahead.
They're all great words, Christopher, but I think there's a really massive equity issue here that you're missing the point on. You're asking a generation to pay $100,000 for a university or thereabout, but members of your own cabinet were basically given free education. So you're basically asking one generation to pay a certain amount for a university degree, but then other generations who are ahead of them who've gone through the education system for free.
Okay,
Just really quickly.
Can I answer that question?
Really quickly.
Well, it's not a question.
There's a great concept
so which I'm going to want to hear from other people.
There was the concept of intergenerational debt. Aren't you basically creating, and this is what you prosecuted Labor with, intergenerational debt? Aren't you yourself hypocritically creating intergenerational debt?
Okay, all right.
And inequity between generations.
As a comment. We'll come back to that point. Keep it in mind, Christopher. You'll get to respond to it here for a couple of other people. Go ahead.
Senator Wong, Labor's $100,000 degrees, the modelling was based on unsubsidised international student fees, an interest rate requiring economic growth to be 3 times its current level and to stay that way for 40 years straight, and they didn't deflate for inflation, which they somehow predicted for 40 years. So isn't the truth that you're being the wrecker in contrast to the coalition's fixer?
Well, okay. And one more gentleman up the back. Go ahead. Go ahead.
He gets a gold star.
You at the back.
How did he get into the audience? How did he get into this audience?
Yeah, my question's for the Education Minister. At the start, you prefaced it by saying Australia has a world-class education system.
Yep.
You then went on to say that it would be unwise to head in the direction of, say, the United States.
Correct.
The Treasurer, at the release of the budget, said that's what Australia should essentially strive for. We lack, yes, he did. We lack what those universities have. It seems illogical to me to chase universities like that, which are highly privatised, highly reliant on funding or support from the elite, essentially. Do you not see the logical flaw in that?
All right, let's hear from both of our politicians. Very briefly, if we can, Christopher, pick up a few of those points. Go ahead.
To this man's point first, the absolute truth is that in 1974, when Gough Whitlam introduced so-called free education, which meant that everybody else paid for people to go to university, the demographic was a certain percentage. In 1989, 88, 89, when Labor reintroduced fees, the exact same demographic of people from low SES backgrounds were going to uni. In other words, poor Australians had paid for rich Australians to go to university. That was the only outcome of free education. It was because of HECS that the university doors were opened to hundreds of thousands of university students to get to university because they didn't have to pay up front. That's the first thing. In terms of your point, the Treasurer has never said we could have American universities because why would we want to? We have the HECS scheme. But very importantly, China, 5 years ago, had no universities in the top 200 in the world. They now have 6 universities in the top 200 in the world, and Australia has 8. If we don't keep being competitive and getting better in our research and our teaching, our international education market, which is our 3rd biggest export after iron ore and coal, will dry up. So there's a vital economic imperative because those international students subsidise Brian's research and all research across universities.
Okay, Penny Wong. And bear in mind that you've essentially been accused of making up the figures of $100,000 degrees.
Yeah. The first gentleman over there, I think I agreed with pretty much everything you said, so I'm not going to respond to it. To the gentleman in the middle, I'm sorry, I don't think he's a fixer. And whatever criticisms you might have of the NatSem research, I just make this point. I haven't seen government modelling which tells me what the fees will be, and that's the first point. Might be the case. I'm the trade shadow, so I'm not the education shadow. So it might be the case that he's put something out. But I ask this philosophical point: what is the merit in having no sky, no limit on how much a university can charge? What is the public policy merit in doing that? I don't see any. End of story. And the gentleman at the end, I can't recall what was actually said in the budget speech, but I don't think there's any doubt in some of the way in which this is talked about that the Americanisation of our higher education system is in part the government's agenda. But that's an opinion.
Yeah, Brian, so brief response. I mean, I think you said that should be capped, right?
Well, I think...
a fixer than a faker.
So I think that the issue comes down to, I was just talking to Bruce Chapman today, who has done modelling as best he can, and he does believe the prices will rise, not instantly, but the price of degrees would rise under a pure uncapped system quite substantially. And I think, and then students would not be getting good value. That's why I think we do need to have some way of limiting that rise if we're going to have...
So you want to say... Bruce Chapman's proposal is to introduce fees so that, like the pension, the more a university takes in private income, it gets less public income. Like with the pension, the more you have in private income, the less pension you get. Now, that is an idea that the Coalition has said we're open to, but not one crossbencher said it would change their vote, and Labor and the Greens have just said no all the way through.
All right, we're going to draw a line. We are going to draw a line under this discussion, but Penny, Wong, you have one more point to make.
I don't think there's anywhere that we could point to anywhere in the world where full deregulation has actually led to lower fee outcomes for students. All right, so it seems to me once you get that point, you understand the nub of the reform.
Okay, we're going to change subjects. A very different subject, in fact. Our next question from Asosa Edmonds.
At the end of the day, celebrities are human beings, just like everybody else. There is no excuse for any celebrity feeling that they are above anyone else. Bullying and violently acting against another human being, as did Top Gear's Jeremy Clarkson against a work colleague, going in and literally verbally abusing and physically attacking another work colleague. Have you, any of you, ever experienced bullying from your own colleagues, and how do you handle that?
Ruby Wax. Can we start? Actually, by asking you...
Jeremy Clarkson. Well,
yeah, I was actually going to say, start by telling us what you think about the sacking of Jeremy Clarkson.
Well, I think it's correct. We don't see what goes on behind the doors of any other business, but I'm not backing them up. Because they're role models. So there's no question. You don't want to say. But there's TV shows with wrestlers and boxers. What kind of message are they sending? All right, I don't want to confuse the issue. No, it wasn't right. But, in the scheme of things, you're talking about education, you're talking about survival. Who cares, really? I mean, it's Jeremy Clarkson. Why should we even discuss it? Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, because the question's been asked about it, it's in the public arena, and we are discussing it. You can choose not to answer if you like,
I don't mind, but it seems like
yeah. We're talking about anxiety, I'm talking about stress, I'm talking about bullying, not just with
bullying.
Yeah, I'm talking about...
In show business.
In show business.
Well, why in show business? You know how rampant bullying is in schools. Nobody's doing it, I mean, it's still... Let's talk about young kids.
Yeah, well, that's
this is out of hand.
I wanted to ask about young kids. What messages do you have for young people?
Well, it doesn't have to do. Again, I'm going back to it. If there was more counselling, or there was more, the teachers were trained a little bit to see the difference between who's just having a bad hair day and who's really ill. And get a little bit more in there instead of whipping them academically. A little bit of, psychological intelligence wouldn't hurt. But again, we're talking about extraneous things, Jeremy Clarkson. Again, let's get to the meat of the matter. You got a problem about bullying? Get Jeremy out of it. Start worrying about bullying. And get teachers educated to deal with it instead of just spewing out some more academics.
Why do you think the issue, the core issue of anxiety and depression is not being, because you talk about anxiety and depression a lot, and you're always talking about getting to the core issue, which we kind of seem to skim over. What do you think it is? Why do you think that we are not, the Australian government or the Australian economy is not putting enough money into really finding out the sources of what anxiety and depression were?
Because these things are a fear, you can't get your hand on it. Cancer you can see, any other disease you can see, but for some reason, 2015, people still think this is an act of imagination. Again, nobody understands, the word depression is not great because it infers that you're having a bad day. It means that you're in a coma, you can't wake up. It's insulting to have people ask, are comedians depressed? I'm saying 1 in 4, there are not that many funny people. Again, just concentrate on the issue,
Is this what your book is about?
And my show, which is on in Melbourne now. Thanks for asking.
Okay, all right. We'll just... since you're doing an advertisement, we might just pause you there for a minute to hear from someone else.
Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt your ad.
No, I was still talking about me.
She does things like that.
I was about to say something nice about you, Christopher.
Ah, great.
Yes, just relax. No, I was going to say, I've been interviewed a number of times by people about the bullying I've talked about occasionally that I experienced when I came here to Australia. And I've always thought it was really interesting how much people wanted to ask me about it because they would use it as part of, I suppose, an engagement with young people about different people who'd been bullied in different ways or experienced some form of bullying, and as part of an outreach to young people who are experiencing it. And I wanted to say, one of the things Chris has continued, I hope you have continued this, was something we funded, which was to roll out the Safe Schools program through the Foundation of Young Australians. So that was something I was very passionate about, which was which was about trying to counter particularly homophobic bullying in our schools. And as you know, kids who are gay, lesbian, are more likely to self-harm, more likely to suffer periods of depression and mental illness. So I will say, well done, Christopher, for continuing that.
Michael. Sosa, I want to pick up on what you originally asked, which is about does it celebrity, does it excuse someone for being a bully? And he played a bully on that TV show. The network was making a lot of money off of him being a bully, and we see this in all aspects of culture. When you read a story on the internet, there's a whole bunch of bullies below writing stuff, and I have people write stuff about me on my Facebook page about, just mean-spirited stuff all the time. And I could tell you, as somebody who was bullied as a kid, I was one of the only brown kids in my whole school. I was the tallest, skinniest kid there, and I was an easy target for bullies, and I grew up with it. So I'm very sensitive to seeing it in all aspects of society, or the way that we bully outsiders, the way that we bully gay people, the way that we bully refugees, the way that we push people out and marginalize
the way
people.
that politicians bully each other.
Yeah.
I mean, we're watching it here.
It's all a part of our. It's all a part of our.
This is friendly
society.
banter. We've known each other since university days.
When we go to the bar afterwards, I'm going to bully Chris, and you'll feel.
So you're just acting like Jeremy is.
Yeah.
Hey, Michael, one of the questions that was asked.
I just wanted to say that it's a part of it, of all of our society, and it's a part of all of us. Whatever it is that is lacking in us, we try to push it out at somebody else and try to belittle somebody else to try to big up that part of who we are. And people talk about homophobia. I don't think homophobia is being afraid of gay people. It's just being an a-hole. There's a difference,
Okay, we're just going to go up in the audience here. Go ahead, sir. Yes, you're right. Go on.
I bet there's a lot of bullying in the party rooms.
Yes, I suspect you're probably right about that.
I think it's an interesting point. Is there more intra-party fighting than fighting between parties? And I think it's a very interesting point. I've been around Parliament for 22 years. Penny, not quite as long as that, but at least 15 or more. Intra-party fighting can be just as intense, if not more intense, than party fighting.
Brian, I'd like to hear you on this subject. It's something we don't necessarily go to astrophysicists to talk about.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. having get to meet a lot of people who are in the public spotlight, you do get treated differently than when you're not in the public spotlight. And some people turn that and they become, I would say, vicious, evil people, become completely detached from reality. So, you know, when I look back to my childhood of being bullied, and probably even a couple times I did bully myself, because I think a lot of us do that, it almost always, when I look at it, comes from insecurity of the bullier more than the person who bullied is just the target. So I think that, you know, one of the things to do is to essentially send messages. It's not good. So in the case of Jeremy Clarkson, I think it is important. He is someone that kids around the world partially because he is a bully, but he stepped out of line, and I think you got to say that's just not cool. And I think it probably does a lot to the 100 million people watch him every week. That
it's interesting, isn't it, that the BBC allowed him essentially to get away with making a series of racist statements, but drew the line when he punched a producer.
That's interesting.
Yeah, well, it should have drawn the line on all of them.
Well, you know, basically with that case, it comes down to there's an illness called fame, because I knew Jeremy Clarkson when he was just a nice guy, but if you infantilize people, you know, and would you like a nice cup of tea? You get free moisturizer for no reason. Suddenly everybody, you know, you're padded from reality. If you took a rat and treated him like that, they too would think they're imperious.
So they'd...
So let's get rats and just treat them like... No, do you know what I mean? Fame is an illness. I'm not backing him up, but that's in the bruise. So kids should learn, don't go into television. Don't try out for X Factor. This will happen to you.
OK. That's a great point to leave the subject you didn't want to talk about. The next question is a video. It's from Terence Houghton in Henley Beach, South Australia.
Minister, why do you persist in making those noises about rescuing the national history curriculum from what you perceive as the diabolical influence of black armband left-wing educators?
Christopher Pyne.
Well, I think that question's a bit old hat.
Is this a real person?
It is a real... It looks like a real person. He's not from my electorate.
Fellow South Australian.
He's from Matt Williams' electorate. Well, I think it's a bit of an old hat question because the national curriculum has been reviewed. The findings of it have been adopted by all the states and territories and the Commonwealth, including Labor and Liberal states and territories. So I think what might have been blown up by the press a few months ago or 6 months ago, in fact, the outcome was extremely sensible and reasonable. We have decluttered the curriculum, especially in primary school, to make it easier for people to focus on maths and science and English, and history has become part of another 3 or 4 other subjects all put together into one so that kids in primary school can focus on what they need to focus on for 6 or 7 years, because you actually have to learn to read before you can read to learn. And if we fail to do that, by the age of 8, we're in all sorts of trouble.
Well, he probably, I just suspect he probably has a long memory and he can remember what you've said in the past, including things like, look at the curriculum, 118 references to Indigenous people and
Terence
culture.
is reading my old speeches and needs to read my new speeches.
I'm reading your old speeches. And
well,
just wondering whether you still believe...
Well,
you're a politician, so I'm asking you whether you still believe what you used to believe.
I think the curriculum we've ended up with is fantastic, and I think it's great that Labor and Liberal state and territory ministers could come together and without any political infighting or ideology try and get a curriculum that's going to be good for student outcomes.
So you've given up that whole idea that there is a black armband?
I'm not going to help you with your outdated research. My view is that our curriculum is better now because of the reforms we've made.
Anyone?
Well, well, to be honest, I think the more important issue is Christopher walking away from the unity ticket on schools funding. I do. I think that we
But we're delivering exactly the next 4 years of funding that Labor promised.
You walked away from the unity ticket and you're going to reduce funding over the long term, and we have a huge equity problem in this country. Where we have 2 to 3 years difference between students because of their geographic or socio-economic status, and it's just unacceptable, and we have to address it. And we went through a long process in the Gonski review. Christopher, Tony Abbott all signed up to it and then walked away from it after the election. I think we need to get back on track. Well,
OK, we've got a questioner with a hand up down here. A hand just jumped up while you were speaking, Penny. Go ahead.
I'd like to know, with all the talk that's going on in Parliament, whether it's bipartisan or not, people get knocked for what they say, such as Christopher being a fixer. My opinion is it's better to be a fixer than a faker. if you do something and you explain it, as Christopher, I believe, has explained it, then it can better education. People like this student here is confused because there's scaremongering campaigns going out there that are confusing these kids of not knowing what their future holds or whether it's even worth going to a university. So at the end of the day, you have to be a fixer, not a faker.
Okay, thank you.
So
We'll
far,
take,
it hasn't
thank
been
you.
fixed.
We'll take that as a comment.
No,
and we'll just
I'd like to respond.
Well,
because I
okay, you
think
can, but there's just another hand up there. That young lady's had a hand up for a long time. I just want to hear what she's got to say, and then we'll come back to you.
Mr. Fixer.
You'll catch up with us another time.
My question...
Are we talking
It's
about
really
drugs
sad.
again?
It's really sad.
Kristen, would you mind
Mr.
listening to the
Fixer?
question, please?
You, previously you mentioned pathways to university. I'd like to pose this question. Would you agree that a merit-based funding model focusing on student compliance, retention and completion rates would be better serve the vocational sector, and would you actually support that in your government?
Okay,
Well,
I'm just going to get Penny Wong to answer the previous statement.
Yeah, just
first.
on you said people would be confused. I'd say two things. First, I think people were confused by the fact that before the last election they were told a lot of things, including that the university funding arrangements would not change and that the Liberals had no plan to increase fees. Well, it's pretty confusing when you get precisely a contrary position then subsequently being put after the election. But I think what you're saying to me is a challenge which I think we do have to take up, which is part of the next election, to make sure we don't do what they did and tell you something that we were elected we would not do, but that before
degrees.
Well, before the election, that we would say this is our approach to university funding. This is what we think we would do, and we would defend it. And I agree with you that we should do that, just as they should not have said something to the Australian people which was clearly not true.
Okay, all right. No, I'm sorry. We're nearly out of time. I'm going to stop both of you. Christopher Pyne, you've got 30 seconds to answer that.
I've got 30 seconds. So let me deal with the issue of completion rates, which was part of your question. I have real problems with paying on completion because it'll lead universities and vet providers to only let students in that they know are going to pass. Now, there are lots and lots of low SES kids or kids who didn't get high ATAR scores who are going to make great university students, maybe great teachers, nurses, whatever, economists, doctors, dentists, and I think we can take them from year 12, give them all the support and training that they need at university to get through uni and make a great contribution. And if we only pay on outcomes, they'll never get the chance to enrol.
Thank you, Christopher. There's time for one last question. This one's from Richard Vantuno.
Thank you, Tony. And this is for Dr. Schmidt on a lighter note. And it's about scientific attribution. In your opinion, who should get credit for the discovery of the first Earth-like planet? I think it's called Gliese 667cc, very catchy, by the way. And should it be the European or the American teams? And furthermore, do you think that the pressure for this celebrity attribution can somehow undermine the scientific process?
So, just as a background, this system you talk about is quite an interesting system. It's 3 stars going around each other, and around the 3rd star there are 3 planets, one of which looks like something it's a habitable zone planet, one of the first ones. It was announced in a press release by the Europeans, but then the paper came out first by the Americans. This is actually quite a similar situation to my discovery of the accelerating universe with my team. There was a press release that sort of hinted at it out of an American team. We put a paper out 6 weeks later. We both got credit for it, as we should have. In this case, the reason we know and believe that system is because both teams worked about it. And so in science, attribution is important, but I can tell you I know the people on both those teams, they're both famous. They both won prizes. They can afford to share because by putting the knowledge together, that's how we really know what's going on. And that's what science is about. And yeah, we all need to get our jobs. It's very competitive right now. But mostly scientists work together, and I will say work together possibly better than some people at this table. That is part of how we get things done. what is for quite a little amount of money compared to what we do.
Brian, I'm just going to quickly bring you to the other part of the question, which is that there's an Earth-like planet that we've discovered.
Yeah, I think that's a showstopper.
You'd like to ask that question too.
You're talking about Jeremy Clarkson, there's life in outer space? What are we talking about?
How far away is it?
Yeah.
So I can't remember. I think it's like 22 light years or something, but don't quote me on
22.3.
It's okay.
Are you kidding?
No, I'm not kidding.
So, you know, so this is one of the first ones, but we do have several other planets that are in habitable zones. What we know from the work in the last 3 years is that 1 in 5 stars has an Earth-like planet in a habitable zone. 1 in 5. There's 100 billion stars in the Milky Way. That's 20 billion chances for a planet that we might want to go hop onto.
And talk about hopping onto it. I mean, 22.3 light years away is quite a long way. How long would it take to get there on a conventional rocket?
That's about, if you go, the fastest spaceship we have right now is one that's going out to Pluto right now, so that's about 150,000 years to get there, but...
Can we use frequent flyer miles? I could say it.
I've got enough, so yeah, we can figure out right. But no, we're working on it. At 150,000, you say that sounds crazy, but the idea of building a self-contained spaceship, that's not crazy. I mean, it's thousands of years in the future.
Can you get there through a wormhole as you do in movies?
I would not be betting on wormholes. Unfortunately, there's something that could exist, but I don't think there's any evidence that they do exist.
Christopher Pyne, sounds like you ought to be giving these kind of scientists a lot more money.
Well, the good news is we are, and Labor cut $563 million on the Sustainable Research Excellence Program. Yes. We're putting it all back.
Can I ask?
There's life on other planets.
We love our scientists.
On the other planet, do you think there's people like him? I ain't going.
The universe is an infinite place.
We'll go together.
There's thousands of them.
But he's infinitely improbable.
It's going to take us 150,000 years.
We're going to have a child.
Richard, I have two things.
Together.
I want to hear from Michael on life on other planets.
Well, Richard, first of all, I think we should name it Spock instead of the other weird name and give it posthumously to Leonard Nimoy, because he inspired so many of us to love space. But I also just want to bring it back to Earth and say, you know, there's so much talk about funding space exploration, which is awesome, and the infinite curiosity, but there's so many things happening here, like taking care of indigenous people's rights to remain on their land, that we don't have to go looking for other lands.
Yeah, but now if we get other planets, do you see what I mean? Well, it's going to work out for everybody.
You got to sort of do it all at the same time. You don't want to let one part go. That all works together as a giant.
Penny Wong.
I agree.
You got any thoughts on life on other planets, or are you finding it hard enough to find life in Canberra?
No, well, I'm still reeling at Ruby's joke about is there one of him there? I thought that was quite funny.
What about Ruby and I having a child?
That's what's going to happen.
It's going to take us... Didn't you hear that bit?
No, I missed that bit. That's even better. That's even better.
You just exploded Twitter.
The horror.
That's even better.
Yeah, don't tell my wife; she would be very embarrassed.
It doesn't matter when we're up there.
I think
who's going to know?
Can I just ask the two of you what you would call him or her?
Oh,
You're
that's
the comedian.
tricky.
You have to come up with the name. You're the comedian.
Oh, God.
Come back to that.
Mr. Chatterbox.
Okay, that is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Brian Schmidt, Christopher Pyne, Ruby Wax, Michael Franti and Penny Wong. Michael, that's your cue. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, Next Monday, we'll be joined by Greek musical legend and former European MP, Nana Mouskouri. Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Kelly O'Dwyer, rising Labor star, Ed Husick. Try and put those three together. And we'll end tonight with Michael Franti singing a new song from his upcoming album, Once a Day. Until next week's Q&A, good night.
No, 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 you never know what the world is gonna show you. It ain't up to you. You always think it's gonna happen to another person, and it's never ever gonna happen to you. You got your friends, you got your money, got your family, got your honey, and you think you got 1,000,000 days. But then life comes along and it knocks you right down to the ground. And that's why I say that everybody ought to hug somebody at least once a day. Everybody ought to kiss somebody at least least once a day. Everybody's gonna miss somebody at least once a day. And everybody gotta love somebody. Put your hands together, y'all. Here we go. And we all will rise up. 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 Tell me how you're feeling, y'all. I heard the purpose of life is to live a life full of purpose, and so don't ever take for granted what the Spirit is giving you in the first verse. You might never get a second verse. This ain't rehearsal, you can't put it in reverse. So just believe in yourself. Don't let nobody being negative tell you what to do. Cause I know in this sweet, sweet life that just this much is true. Hey, hey, everybody ought to hug somebody at least once a day. Everybody ought to kiss somebody at least once a day. Everybody's gonna miss somebody at least once a day. And everybody gotta love somebody. I wanna see you all on your feet now. And we all will rise up. And we all will rise up. There you go. And we all will rise up. 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 Yo. You look over the road at your life so small. You got to dream big like the sky won't fall. You got to break through like the Berlin Wall. And if we fall down, we rise up, we rise up, we rise. We rise up, we rise up, we rise. Because everybody ought to hug somebody at least once a day. Go ahead and hug somebody. Everybody ought to kiss somebody at least once a day. Give somebody a kiss. Everybody's gonna miss somebody at least once a day. And everybody gotta love somebody every day. Play that guitar, Jay. Australia, make some noise. And we all will rise up. Let me hear. And we all will rise up. 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 Make some noise. Thanks, y'all. We even got some hugs and kisses over there.